Welcome to Come Follow Me, week 16, which takes us to the end of the replacement text. And so for the first chapter we have is Enos, and it's just one chapter, but it's a fairly decent one. And one of the first things that happens in Enos is the idea of Enos as a young man coming to terms with his spirituality and his own understanding of guilt and wanting to be clean. It's part of a prayer narrative that runs throughout the Book of Mormon where mighty men are supplicated before the Lord. But here we see it kind of at its end conclusion, which is Enos really praying for the ferventness of his situation and also that of the Lamanites and the Nephites. It's also part of a really strong narrative in this replacement text that you need to have an encounter with God in order to be a prophet and to prophesy. And so what you also see here in Enos is the beginnings of a first vision account. And it's very similar to what Joseph then pens for himself in 1832, being distressed and becoming convicted of the sins and then mourning for those sins. But then having God or Jesus come and console and also provide a remission of sins. And we see this happening to Enos, that he gets forgiven. And this is possible because of Jesus. And as he has this remission, he's going to look out now for the welfare of others. And God gives him some solace. America is the Holy Land, and it is kept as something special for those who worship Jesus. And he wants to get a promise from God for the Nephites and for the Lamanites, the idea that if the Nephites get destroyed because of their wickedness, that the Lamanites will take over. And this is in the replacement text, so we know that this is going to happen already. But it's interesting, Enos developing this theme in retrospect, but it's seeming like it is prophetic. We also have this reference to James 1:5, whatever you ask of God in faith, he will deliver it, which totally also goes along with the first vision narrative and development. But in terms of the Lamanites, it's all for vain because they don't seem to be listening to the Nephites preaching. And we see those same tropes coming through for the Native Americans, the idea that they're evil in nature, that they're wild and ferocious and bloodthirsty and full of idolatry and filthiness. And he specifically says that they wander about in the wilderness with short-skinned girdles about their loins and their heads shaven and their skill was with the bow. And it's really just describing Native Americans. And in contrast, the Nephites, or the Gentile settlers, they're tilling the land, raising grain, flocks of herds, fruit, manner of cattle, and in here there's some anachronisms, goats and wild goats, and also horses. And also an idea that the Lamanites, the Native Americans, are there to scourge the Gentiles, to keep them in remembrance of their covenants with God. And in closing, Enos talks about the fact that he has to do all this preaching and prophesying, that as a prophet amongst these people, that's his role. And he then quotes John chapter 14, verse 2, talking about then going to see the Redeemer and being blessed with the mansions that he's prepared. We're also told in Enos that it's 179 years since Lehi left Jerusalem. And so we've got these three generations, Lehi, Jacob, and then Enos within this 180-year time period, which is that 60-year average generation, which is just not possible. Joseph is desperately trying to finish the replacement text, and he's jumping ahead in time too much, and he's not allowing for enough authors to author this. So one of the great things about this chapter is it has so many Joseph anachronisms. It has the idea of a first vision before the first vision has actually been recorded. It has New Testament passages in it. It has these tropes about Native Americans and also Gentile white settlers. And it's also got this human reproduction anachronism with regard to the generations of authors. And then on top of that, it has animal anachronisms, things that are just not in the place and time that they should be. And so we see that this is very much Joseph talking about his own life, his own experience, maybe his own wanting to have this prophetic understanding of God all contained within this one chapter. All right, let's have a look at Jerem, which is one chapter, 15 verses or 15 sentences that covers another 60 years. There are some great things to learn, and the first one is that there's this kind of commandment that the genealogy might be kept. And I think this is really important for Joseph, that there's some kind of provenance for the Book of Mormon, that you can track the people that created it so that it gives it some historical basis and weight. But as Jerem explains, the plates are small, and so he's not going to be able to write very much, and he iterates this several times, even within these few sentences. There is also a reiteration of this intent that it is to benefit the Lamanites. And this is part of the title page of the Book of Mormon. And this is really problematic because we can't find any Lamanites. There is no DNA to suggest that any of the people that we've ever taught the Book of Mormon to, who are native peoples of the America, are in fact descendants of Israelites, that they might even possibly be Lamanites. And Joseph is really trying to finish this work quickly, and so he's using the voice of Jerem to say, basically, I'm not going to write a lot of things here. You've already got the witnesses of the prophets. What more can I add? But by verse 4, he's telling you that there are some wonderful revelations. He's just not going to actually give them to you. And verse 3 is really a commentary from Joseph on the people that he's dealing with who are Gentiles in the surrounding area. These people are hard-hearted and deaf and blind to the mercies of God. He is absolutely describing these white settler Gentile Europeans who are the basis for his communities, and he's judging them as being completely unrighteous. And he's also judging the Lamanites, or the Native Americans, because he's again saying how murderous that they are and how they drink blood of beasts. You know, this is the idea that the Lamanites, the Native Americans, are a fallen people, and so he's judging them as well. But he's also iterating a couple of times about the law of Moses and how these people are observing the law of Moses, but in preparation to understand Christ. And this becomes a major theme of the Book of Mormon, of course, that it is Israelites in America 600 years before Christ, believing in Christ, acting as if Christ is coming, but obeying the law of Moses. And this is a very big New Testament 19th century Protestant understanding of the world. And we also get the understanding from Jerem that the land is being saturated by the Lamanites and the Nephites. They're covering all of the land of the Americas. And as they spread on the land, they're becoming exceedingly rich in gold and silver and precious things and workmanship and machinery. And they're dealing with iron and copper and brass and steel. And they're making tools and weapons. These are just things we cannot find in the Americas. And it's totally anachronistic. But prophets are coming, teaching them about the law of Moses, helping them to observe it, and also bringing them back into Christ because of these wars. And Jerem explains again that these plates are small, and that's why there's not much information here. So if you want to learn about the wars, you have to go to the other plates. And 238 years have passed away, so it's been another 60 years since we've seen Enos, and again we're passing on to another son. That means that Jerem is at least 80 years old if he's passing it on to a 20-year-old son. These generations of 60 years are just not in keeping with real life. Joseph does not know what a generation is, and he's just messing this up. The end of the replacement text is Omni. It's really the last book of the Book of Mormon, and it covers roughly 230 years in one chapter. So this is massive because 200 years, and if you count 4th Nephi, which is 300 years in one chapter, means that 2 chapters in the Book of Mormon cover half the time period of the text. And those 230 years cover 4 generations, which works out to be about 60 years per generation, consistent average. So we have Omni, who is the son of Jerem, and then his 2 children, Amram and Chemish, and then Chemish's son, Abinadom, and then his son, Amalekith. The Book of Omni gives a good understanding of what might have been in the original manuscript that we have now lost, and that is a lot of war, a lot of fighting. Omni and others describe the idea that they took up arms themselves to fight, that there were seasons of peace and many seasons of serious war. So if you don't like the war chapters that are in Helaman, pretty much the original text would have had a lot of war in it, much more than just those verses and chapters and the end of Alma and through into Helaman. And we learn that the reason for this is that the Nephites had become wicked, and the Lord was keeping his promise that only those who are righteous should be saved, and so the wicked parts were destroyed in order for the righteous Nephites to continue. You have this cute understanding that plates were transferred between brothers on the day that they were engraved, but again, this idea that people fought with their own hands. And we also see the same iteration that the history parts are held by the kings, and so they're not on these plates, and that the prophecies are sufficient, so they're also not now in this part of the replacement text. But one of the great oddities of Omni is that it explains a number of issues that you come up with if you don't have the history prior to Mosiah. And one of them is that the idea of the land of Zarahemla and why people are actually there and not in the land of Nephi. We learn that King Mosiah I fled the land of Nephi because he was warned by the Lord. And this is very similar to Nephi leaving and Lehi leaving. It's a common narrative in the Book of Mormon. And we find out that there are people already in Zarahemla, and we learn later that they're Mulekites, but because they don't have records, their language has been confounded and confused. And this plays into another narrative in the Book of Mormon, which is the idea that without the plates, without the scriptures, without this understanding of language, you're going to fall into wicked traditions, which is what happens to the Lamanites. And of course, the people of Zarahemla have a genealogy, but that's not on these plates. But Mosiah has got a special power that he's able to interpret engraved writings, and he's able to take a stone and learn about the Jaredites. The Jaredites have come from the Tower of Babel at the confounding of the languages, and their bones lay scattered in the land northward, which is these heaps of bones, these mound builder myths. Amaleki gives his testimony, just like you see from Moroni at the end of the Book of Mormon proper. And there is another gap filler story that talks about some people who went back to the land of Nephi, which is going to dovetail into what you need to know in order to understand the story in Mosiah. And just like Moroni, Amaleki is going to tell you that the plates are full. So this one chapter, which covers more than 200 years, is going to bring you up to speed so that you can start to read Mosiah and for it to make sense. This seems to be a little bit more than convenient, that the replacement text exactly replaces the space of time that is lost by the lost manuscript, which is another huge tell that it is Joseph Smith creating this document. The last thing to look at with regard to the replacement text is the Words of Mormon. This is one chapter inserted between the end of the replacement text and the first book of Mosiah to harmonize the transition and to explain why there is a replacement text in the first place. This is supposedly written by Mormon, who is abridging the record and finds these small plates, and he explains that it's for a wise purpose that the Lord has provided these alternate plates to confound some kind of problem that's going to happen in the future. So let's fact check Mormon and use the verses in Words of Mormon to determine whether he's telling the truth. Mormon makes the claim that he's handing off the records to his son Moroni, and that he hopes that Moroni will be able to write some more. The problem with this statement is that in Mormon chapter 8, Moroni says that he's got the records, but that he can't write anymore because there is no more ore and there's no more room on the plates. This is a serious problem. The next claim is that Mormon finds these alternate plates and finds them really pleasing, so includes them in his record. However, Moroni, who gets the plates from his father and has presumably read them, he doesn't know that Isaiah features heavily in 1st and 2nd Nephi, because he gives a command to search the words of Isaiah in Mormon chapter 8. And this is even more problematic because Jesus, who is supposed to be omnipotent, he doesn't know in 3rd Nephi chapter 23 that Isaiah features heavily in 1st and 2nd Nephi, because he also gives the same command. Mormon then makes the claim that he's going to take these records and put them with the remainder of his plates, and this is going to provide a lot more spirituality, and he's doing this for a wise purpose. And this is echoed in 1 Nephi chapter 19 and also in Doctrine and Covenants section 10. And Mormon records that these plates are put with King Benjamin's plates, and they're handed down from generation to generation with the kings. This is consistent with Doctrine and Covenants section 10. But it's wholly unknown in Mosiah chapter 1, because when Benjamin gives the records and the artifacts and the relics to his son Mosiah, he doesn't mention these small plates at all. The Book of Mormon proper does not make a difference. It does not distinguish about the small plates. And this is a huge problem because it's mentioned in 1 Nephi chapter 9, chapter 19, 2 Nephi 5, Jacob 1, Words of Mormon 1, Doctrine and Covenants 3, Doctrine and Covenants 10, and the preface to the 1830 Book of Mormon, but it's not mentioned in Mosiah or Alma or Helaman or 3rd Nephi. It just is not there. Mormon then makes the claim that King Benjamin is this righteous king who goes to war and fights for peace and establishes the truth of the gospel. And Mormon ends with the idea that King Benjamin has established peace in all the land. This is exactly what it says in Mosiah chapter 1, verse 1. This is incredible and actually unbelievable because Mormon knows exactly when Mosiah is going to start off. So he knows exactly, apparently, 1500 years in the future, where the replacement text needs to absolutely end and for it to dovetail into what has been lost. This is a massive tell that the words of Mormon are written after the replacement text is envisioned and understood as an idea to get around this problem of this lost manuscript. Words of Mormon can be fact-checked and it does not equal the evidence. If you're interested in the replacement text and perhaps what was the original text, one of the best books to read is The Lost 116 Pages by Don Bradley. Don tries to reconstruct what might have been in the original manuscript by looking at passages in the Book of Mormon, things that are in the replacement text that gives us clues about its content, and also what is missing into Mosiah and Alma that don't make any sense without there being some backstory. One of the things to know about the lost manuscript is that it probably wasn't actually 116 pages. We believe that this was just the page number of the replacement text, and Joseph said later that this matched what was there, but this doesn't seem to be accurate because Martin Harris probably purchased the paper and he had at least 200 pages of it. Plus two, they worked on it from April the 14th through to at least June the 12th, which means that it covers almost 2 months, and 116 pages is what was done during 2.5 weeks in June of 1829. So presumably what Joseph did with Martin is much larger, maybe at least 200 or maybe even longer to 250 pages. This would also make sense because it covers about 370 years of that initial time period from 600 BC through to 130 BC. And this kind of time period in the rest of the Book of Mormon is much longer. Don talks about the idea that there were some people that were interviewed about the Gold Bible that included Joseph Smith Sr., and some of his understandings of the text don't match what we currently have, so may have well come from the original manuscript. But the best source is the Book of Mormon itself, and particularly the replacement text, which seems to indicate that there is a lot of war, that there is a lot of more history, the idea that it's not as spiritual, and the idea that the Lehi coming out of Jerusalem story was a lot more in keeping with an idea of an exodus and a plagiarism on that particular story. And the interpreters, or the seer stones, just kind of appear in Mosiah, but there's probably a backstory of how the interpreters got from the Jaredites through to the Nephites, and probably include an understanding of Mosiah first. Don also talks about how the interpreters took over from the Liahona as being a guide for the people and being a prophetic instrument. Lots to discover and lots to understand about the Book of Mormon and its original text and how it developed. One of the things that's especially interesting to me is the idea of what does the replacement text mean for the Book of Mormon and for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think the answer is pretty clear, and that is, if the replacement text had not happened, there would be no Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When you look at Mosiah and Alma and Helaman, what you see is a Christian adventure story, kind of like Pilgrim's Progress. In many ways, the Book of Mormon is just a way to explain why the world was the way it was when Joseph Smith was living. Kind of like a how did the leopard get its spots kind of a story. Things like why are the native people so brown and dirty when they had come from Israelite stock. The idea that they were a fallen nation really explained that. Why were the Gentile Europeans able to have this inheritance in America? And these are the kinds of questions that Joseph Smith was trying to answer and to satisfy through the Book of Mormon text. Many of the ideas in Mosiah and Alma were about reducing conflict, particularly those spiritual conflicts that were happening in the Smith home, because Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. were just in different places on their religious spectrum. The Book of Mormon became more spiritual with Jesus' visit to the Americas, but pretty much he just says the same things that are in the New Testament, so there wasn't really anything to add. But this all changed when Joseph and Emma and Oliver moved from Harmony, Pennsylvania, where they were suffering some persecution, through to Fayette, New York, to the Whitmer home. The Book of Mormon was an oratory production. Joseph had ideas of what he wanted to say, and then he would recite, and Oliver or Emma would write it down. And they were the audience. They were the ones that were receiving this on his basis. He was expecting that other people would read it, but generally his first audiences were those of his scribes. But when he got to the Whitmers, there was a lot more audience. The whole Whitmer family were involved in understanding what was rolling off Joseph's tongue. And despite pressing Martin, he could not recover the original manuscript, and so he had to begin again with an alternate beginning. This new material, with the Whitmers in the background asking him about it, asking him to explain the spirituality of the Book of Mormon, created a situation that improved the value of the Book of Mormon to be on par with the Bible as a companion set of scripture. And this also meant a desire to get a church organized with the resulting text. We see this with the inclusion of Moroni and a lot of ordinances in there. We see this with the idea that the Book of Mormon was on par with the Bible in 2nd Nephi. And we see this in June of 1829 because of the revelations that were coming from Joseph, and also that Oliver Cowdery was engaging and creating some documents of covenants around a church. So within the month of June 1829, a church was envisioned, and an idea that this would come forth as an organization was born. Without the replacement text, its emphasis on a more spiritual understanding, and without things like Moroni, we would not have a church. If Joseph had got to Fayette and recovered the lost manuscript, it would have been added on. There would be no such thing as Ether, no such thing as Moroni. There would be the original manuscript, and it would just be a Christian adventure story, much like Pilgrim's Progress. It might have sold well, but it wouldn't be a church. The replacement text is critical for there being the Church of Christ organized in 1830 that then became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In finishing off the replacement text, I think there's just a few things left to be said that are worthy of covering. I think there are a number of things that we can tell for certain with regard to the production of the Book of Mormon and its timeline that are really important. For instance, we know that Oliver Cowdery came to Harmony on the 5th of April and began scribing for Joseph on the 7th of April, and he probably started somewhere in about mid-Mosiah to do this. We also know that Emma and Oliver and Joseph went to Fayette, New York on the 1st of June.
And generally, we know that the dictation of the Book of Mormon was completed by the end of June into the beginning of July. So this all took roughly 3 months. I think it's also pretty clear that Ether and Moroni were written in Fayette, and all of the replacement text was done there too. And hopefully I've done a good job of showing that I think it's pretty much Joseph, that there is no co-conspirators, there's nobody else helping, except for the fact that they're unwittingly adding to the story by the questions that they're asking and the understandings that they're bringing to the table in discussions with Joseph. So Oliver is influencing the text from Alma through to 3rd Nephi, and then the Whitmers are influencing the text from Moroni through 1st and 2nd Nephi through to Jarom and Omni. I can also see that Oliver's influence is really ramping up in Fayette, New York in June of 1829. He's taking on a lot more responsibility. And we can tell from the printer's manuscript that he's making some changes. So now Oliver is influencing the text directly. So I think it's possible that there's a lot more editing happening in the production of the printer's manuscript from essentially July and August right through to February of the following year. The printer's manuscript took over 6 months to complete, which means that it's twice the timeline of the Book of Mormon, and they're just copying down the text, which suggests that there may be some editing going on there. But because we don't have a lot of the original manuscript, we can't quite tell. But for all you detectives out there, I think there's a lot to understand about the production of the Book of Mormon, and particularly that time period, which would be really interesting to deduct and decode the Book of Mormon. And I'll be doing a podcast with Mormonish in the coming week on the replacement text. So if you have any questions, ask them. I'm happy to answer. Or maybe if you've got some input about this time period and what it's involved and who is doing what and why and how it influences the text of the Book of Mormon, I'd love to hear it. Collectively, I think we can deconstruct the Book of Mormon and understand its components related to Joseph Smith and the surrounding environment and the people involved with regard to how it came about.